Hello, everyone. My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and welcome back to the New Movie Diary. This is a cinema criticism series in which I review recent, new, and up and coming film releases and attempt to give you the straight facts about them, in my humble opinion. And in my humble opinion, Boots Riley's Sorry to Bother You is not good. I remember when this came out in the summer of 2018. This was one of those high marquee festival favorites of that year. And while fitting into no mainstream category, being a bespoke, highly stylized fusion of anti comedy and dystopian science fiction and leftist progressive agitprop and afro-surrealism, it managed to turn a handsome profit on its surprisingly modest $3 million budget while also accruing a significant amount of critical favor, as well as a predictably die-hard cult fandom almost immediately. Many of whom had, up to that point, especially for an American production, even on the independent film side, never really seen a picture of its kind, one that defied so many categories, basically seemed to appease no mainstream impulse, and was certainly especially important as a watershed moment for films by Black American filmmakers. Even in the same year that Ryan Coogler's Black Panther was being heralded as its own watershed moment for Black representation in American blockbuster fantasy cinema, and only a year after Jordan Peele's Get Out had heralded its own explosion in a new cycle of low-budget, Black-focused, borderline art house genre cinema. Sorry to Bother You was its own outlier, so far off the grid in terms of what gets any kind of major motion picture, especially a Black-focused one, for it to receive that kind of mainstream theatrical exposure, that I guess we should be able to rest on the laurels that a production like it was even possible, and of course clearly paved the way for future Black filmmakers who similarly wanted to push the envelope on not just Black-focused film, but even more radically adjacent what was possible in terms of American pop culture hegemony in general. You absolutely would not have, say, Is God Is, for instance, without Riley setting the cornerstone with Sorry to Bother You. We should be able to appreciate the significance of that contribution to our collective film culture while acknowledging that when push comes to shove, while you can look at a Rotten Tomatoes score and get a very distorted sense of what the aggregate of professional film critics actually thought about Sorry to Bother You in terms of the sum of its parts, whether they were actually giving it a glowing review or more so saying, this is messy, this is disappointing in many respects, but it's offbeat, it's different, and it's worth seeing just as a shakeup on its own terms. We should be able to acknowledge that a film like Sorry to Bother You is emphatically a production that is not intended to any degree to be liked, much less loved by everybody, especially to the extent of Riley's explicit politiquing with the film, the way it tells this satirical story that, in the shadow of the first Trump administration, presents a darkly comedic, exaggerated depiction of a society in which corporate billionaires are effectively funneling an increasingly precarious, larger working class into forms of oppressive wage slavery, where any individual financial success is predicated on our benefiting from a system that constantly exploits and extracts from the even more vulnerable below us, even before its big third act twist, which still, I won't spoil it, Sorry to Bother You, effectively stars Lakeith Stanfield as a downwardly mobile Black millennial who goes to work at a call center and ends up succeeding for the first time in his life, but in a job where we end up learning, oh, they're bringing back slavery. My man is literally making bank being a slaver. It was incredibly ballsy, intentionally offensive, incisive stuff that was not intended to bring audiences together. It's intended to galvanize and divide. We should be able to acknowledge and appreciate what it takes to even make a movie of that kind and the importance of having it in our cinematic culture, while also taking with it that a lot of people are just not going to like it. And even if they say, decided to give it a charitable rewatch some 8 years later in preparation for Riley's sophomore follow up, it's perfectly understandable that those same people would still not like it. And I am definitely one of those people. I think Sorry to Bother You kinda sucks, honestly. Sorry to Bother You is a rather classic 2.5 out of 5 for me. All I can say about it is that it is very original, very different, very offbeat, and that I generally agree with all of its politics. I appreciate that Boots Riley was, like, literally using his film as not just a satire, but as an allegory to promote democratic socialism and radical worker solidarity at a time when the mainstream political consensus was basically that, hey, let's just ignore this clown man fascist and try to wait it out until we're back to normalcy. It's not like there are any underlying systemic contradictions setting liberal progressivism against capitalism that need to be resolved to forestall this from snowballing 2 more presidential cycles down the line into a full-blown fascist movement. I can acknowledge all of those things, but besides that, I think Sorry to Bother You is just not a terribly impressive production unto itself. I think the surrealist elements were rather incidental and often totally predictable and obvious, despite how colorful and deliberately stylized almost every frame and cut was. The actual character elements felt stiff and unenervated, and on top of that, I don't think that it's just that Riley has an offbeat sense of humor. If anything, I think it's remarkable how lowest common denominator the gags in Sorry to Bother You end up being, so that the whole film comes off less like this really show-stopping stick of independent film dynamite and more like, well, a guy who thinks he's much funnier than he actually is, basically making a politically correct version of Idiocracy, where it's never more surreal than your average Adam McKay joint and never much funnier than the most phoned-in Seth Rogen, Evan Goldberg project. With that in mind, I still went into Riley's latest production, I Love Boosters, with a significant degree of optimism. The impressive aspects of Sorry to Bother You were enough to leave me anxious to see how such a unique combination of creative impulses developed over time, not just for Riley as a filmmaker unto himself, but, you know, now that not only is Trump president again and all the underlying systemic contradictions that Sorry to Bother You satirized contemporaneously have snowballed into a full-blown fascist movement overseeing the internal collapse of the American empire, Sorry to Bother You is now a movie haunted by the fact that Riley's absolutely correct politics, that one where you don't just prop up one clown fascist in effigy of all the most explicitly deplorable aspects of American culture, where you acknowledge that it is that American empire that is the problem. There has really only been within the last 2 years a kind of 25th hour rush to reckon with those things on any kind of effective collective scale. So when it comes to I Love Boosters, you really need to ask with hope and some morbid curiosity how Riley's creative vision is supposed to develop when, as such a consistently and expressly political artist, those political undercurrents weren't affected at all. The only political development within the last 8 years has been the aggravation of present conditions to a degree that it could be argued that it now even outstrips Riley's past vision. The present authoritarian reality is even more severe and deleterious than the satiric exaggeration that Riley conjured 2 presidential cycles ago. And that haunted feeling, that haunting of unresolved political contradictions, in the case of I Love Boosters, it is both this production's worst hang-up and its best feature that it is basically a retread of Sorry to Bother You, a version of Sorry to Bother You that just heightens its contradictions even more. As with Riley's previous film, I Love Boosters takes place in a now rather debatably exaggerated, surreal, satirical world and focuses on characters living on the margins of increasing economic precarity. In this case, Keke Palmer as Corvette, where Stanfield's anti-hero Cash in Sorry to Bother You was mooching out of his uncle's garage, Corvette is squatting in an abandoned chicken shack. And anti-hero is the term I'd use. Just like Stanfield's Cash Green, Palmer's Corvette is not an unsympathetic or unaffectionate character, but they are, how shall we say, ethically ambivalent. Corvette herself never gets in as deep as becoming a power caller in a company that traffics in slave labor, but she is the leader of a foxy girl gang that boosts high-end fashion stores and sells the haute couture on the streets. This is all a hustle, of course. Corvette is herself a DIY fashion designer. Perhaps a better summation of her role in this film would be like if you took the ethical flakiness of Cash Green and fused them with his artist girlfriend Detroit, played by Tessa Thompson in Sorry to Bother You. Corvette isn't just a typical bend with the wind, complacent dude. She's also a disappointed and deferred artist. Even certain plot twists from Sorry to Bother You are echoed in I Love Boosters as well, although they don't necessarily lead to the same or similar dramatic complications. For instance, just like Cash plays the field as far as joining the union initiative at the call center he works at while also accepting every cynical upward opportunity, when Corvette goes in for a fake job interview at a store that she and her gang plan to heist, she's surprised that she gets hired, that the douchebag manager played by Will Poulter actually really likes her and thinks she's basically perfect for exactly their sort of cynical hustler career. And yes, the other vendors, led by Isa Gonzalez as Violetta, are trying to unionize themselves, but Corvette's motives remain ambivalent. On the one hand, she idolizes the fashion designer and brand manager of the stores that she is boosting, that being Christy Smith, played by Demi Moore. She's not just boosting high-end fashion from everywhere. She's actually stealing stuff that she loves and admires, what she's hustling out on the streets, as opposed to bootleg items, for instance. It's a reflection of what she wants others to see, symbols of art and beauty that she wants to share with others. She's a regular Robin Hood of haute couture, which is now hot in two senses. You even really get a sense that that's where the title of the movie is coming from. The reason Riley loves boosters is because they're stealing from the rich and giving to the broke. And especially in this context, they're stealing the creative potential and the artistic production that is only reserved for the ultra affluent and rich and giving it to the poor, who, despite their circumstances, are just as able to identify with it, see beauty in it, and really understand the enigmatic power of fashion, what it can do to the self-esteem of a person. But when Corvette realizes that a design she submitted to a contest was surreptitiously stolen by Christy Smith, that kicks the boosting into overdrive. The motive becomes to humiliate and embarrass Christy, but the fight never turns expressly political for Corvette. Violetta is constantly treated as this interloper, nibbling around the edges and rounding out parallels and echoes from Sorry to Bother You. Yes, there is a left-field science fiction twist that sends an already chaotic canvas, spattered with just about anything that pops into Riley's unencumbered noodle, into full-blown pop art anarchy. So yeah, it's a pretty blatant retread of Sorry to Bother You. And you know what? The second crack at this was better. I think part of what helps is that the two biggest hang-ups I had with Sorry to Bother You aren't fixed so much as they are pragmatically reformed. It's not a laugh riot, and it's not trying to be, but I think the comedic frequency of I Love Boosters is a lot more legible than Sorry to Bother You, or at least some of the more obvious gags actually land. I Love Boosters even opens with a good gag, which is crazy. Look, Boots Riley isn't funny. He shouldn't try to be funny. Can we please start telling rappers that they aren't funny? So many rappers who move into movies try to do funny stuff, and I'm sorry, if you rap, 9 times out of 10, you're a comedy sinkhole. Please stop trying to be funny. So it's funnier, but also, whereas my biggest beef with Sorry to Bother You is that it kind of has this surrealist posture, whereas its use of surrealism itself is rather incidental or even functional. It just felt overly constrained by the most obvious visual metaphors or just ways of telling an otherwise not very compelling story in a fancy, bespoke way. I Love Boosters is an actually surrealist film. Riley really is swinging for the fences on this one, from characters being able to change to white passing by holding their breath, to Demi Moore's character living in a leaning skyscraper so her luxury apartment and office is always at a canted angle, to a meeting of a pyramid scheme slash cult slash self-help seminar where there's a massage chair with labia-like flaps that literally wrap over your arms and face and practically molest you while you're sitting in it, to Corvette periodically seeing a giant boulder of refuse tumbling towards her that nobody else can see, to Lakeith Stanfield's role in this as a character referred to only as Pinky Ring Guy. Watch out for that guy. He's going to be the star of a short film unto himself that is almost definitely where most people are going to say that this thing really went off the rails, versus when just the right amount of people are going to be like, okay, now this is a movie. This is actually different and interesting. I got it. I'm in. I'm in. I won't spoil it, but I have 3 words for you. Stop motion animation. I Love Boosters is chock-a-block with some of the best, weirdest stop motion you've seen outside of Mad God. I do also have to say that I found the performances in I Love Boosters demonstrably superior to anything in Sorry to Bother You. A big part of what I think made Riley's debut feel so stiff and phony was that he always seems to be hemmed in between these contradictory impulses to ask his performers to be naturalistic for the most part, whereas his storyboarding and shot composition is clearly so exact that there's often not a lot of room for his actors to move and breathe. Whereas I think that with I Love Boosters, Riley has not only become even more maximalist in terms of his composition of each and every shot, to his incorporation of the actors as part of the mise en scène, but better at really inviting his actors into being a part of that shot, to understand that it's not enough for them to just say the lines naturally, that they kind of have to inhabit the part that calls upon them to project and speak so much more while often doing so little. Keke Palmer is an absolute godsend to Riley as a director. She really runs away with the surreal world, whereas Stanfield and Sorry to Bother You just kind of seem to sleepwalk through it. Taylor Page and Naomi Ackie round out the core trio. Stanfield himself is actually excellent in this. Frankly, it's one of his first really interesting performances that I've seen outside of Atlanta from him. I've always felt like he was an actor where, if anything, Sorry to Bother You exemplified his not being pushed nearly far enough in terms of what he could be achieving, but let me say, he pulls off something very special as Pinky Ring Guy, such a strange combination of delightful and just weird. Will Poulter, though in a small part, gives an especially exceptional performance, and it's honestly a sequence with him that doesn't feature the core girl gang trio that kind of defines so much of what makes I Love Boosters compelling to me in a way that Sorry to Bother You just felt kind of rigid and performative even. Basically, Violetta and her coworker are going up to ask their manager Grayson, Will Poulter, why their paychecks are so low. And he is just blasting bro step music, and he's just using it to drown out what they're talking about. And the thing is that for a lot of I Love Boosters, the sound mixing choices in this film are a choice. Again, a thing about how Riley directs actors is that he seems to coach them to treat his surreal environment in more naturalistic ways, which means that very often the speaking voices of the characters in his films are pretty low key. But with I Love Boosters, the music for the film, composed by the Oakland art pop group Tune Yards, it's so bizarre unto itself, almost like a hip-hop interpretation of Danny Elfman, and it's mixed so loud on the soundtrack that when it meets that low key of the character's more naturalistic speaking, very often the score is literally drowning out the dialogue. And then you literally get to this scene where this placeholder dubstep is just blasting in your ear, and the whole gag is that the characters are like, I can't hear you. The music is too loud. And then on top of that, Riley doesn't do the gag and wrap it up. He really kind of stretches this bit out to a degree where you can't help but wonder if this isn't as intentional as having his characters in Sorry to Bother You comment upon how the black characters' white voices sound overdubbed. Whereas in Riley's debut, that kind of came off as an honestly rather pathetic way of getting around the fact that he knew the dubbing couldn't work, not just because the voice wouldn't be convincing, but because those vocal performances would never match what Stanfield was doing. With I Love Boosters, though, this really feels more like a very aggressive, even acerbic acknowledgement to the audience that Riley is saying, you are not missing something. Yes, I know the music is really weird and really loud and really intrusive, and kind of conflicting with your ability to enjoy the movie as a movie. It's not that he's fucking with us. Okay, he's clearly kind of just glibly fucking with his audience because he thinks it's funny. Look, guys, we gotta tell rappers they aren't funny. But he's not just fucking with us. I think I Love Boosters does a much better job of articulating its oppositional relationship as a work of art, which for Riley, with his very clear politics, where the haunted message of this being a fine-tuned retread of Sorry to Bother You, a reboot of Sorry to Bother You, or dare I say it, a knockoff of his previous film, a bootleg version of something he already made. The nature of the art for Riley here is inherently discursive. He's perhaps more demonstrably committed than any other American filmmaker at this moment to truly antagonizing his viewer out of the complacency of any kind of passive consumption with his work. He wants to disturb us away from that comfort to an extent that he's even, yes, willing to just plain with us, whereas Sorry to Bother You came off like little more than Adam Sandler meets Spike Lee. I Love Boosters is more like Wes Anderson meets Lars von Trier. This gets all the way down to the fact that when that sci-fi twist does come up in the story, such as it is, there really is no spectacular escalation in the action of I Love Boosters. This production cost more than 6 times what Sorry to Bother You did, but what's noticeable is that even as we get closer to the inevitable action climax, clearly satirical in and of itself, the production value actually goes down, or Riley tries to direct it in such a way, organize it in such a way that the way he presents these things will make us think the production value is going down. It will look like it's cheaping out even if he's technically doing something very audacious. More of the live action beats are pulled off with absolutely no attempt to make them convincing, much less spectacular, almost like Riley is parodying that very expectation. He's taken that $20 million and spent it on exactly what he wanted to, but when it comes to whether or not the big action set pieces deliver any actual payoff, he couldn't care less, because why would I do that? You already have lots of dystopian fantasy and action just like that, but what if you had more stop motion monsters? As with the music component, you start to realize that, oh, Riley is basically incorporating this into the kind of language of the film, its satiric register, where the fact that they spent so much of that money on costume sets and stop motion that they almost get to make a deadpan joke about how they had no money left to make a good action scene, that all of that stuff was going to look like it was shot in a warehouse for peanuts, whereas all the actual budget went into all the setup and none of the payoff. It's like being able to observe the difference between where, with Sorry to Bother You, it really felt like an outstanding filmmaker being very economical and deliberate so that he could get the maximal potential out of each setup and shot that he had, whereas now with I Love Boosters, he has much more freedom to be able to say, no, I know exactly where I want the money to go, and there are parts of this movie where I don't want the money to go there because I want it to look cheap. I don't want this part to look expensive. I want it to look weird and like something nobody has ever seen before. It looking spectacular and expensive means nothing to me. This other stuff over here, I want it to look like what it is, which is we did not spend a lot of money on these parts because they're not really that important. It's definitely fascinating and consistently engaging, but as with Sorry to Bother You, this is not a film to be liked per se. That's kind of the point. Riley is out to blow minds and break us free of formulaic expectations so that, who knows, I don't know, just as in art, we might treat life as something where our regression into formula expectation sends us down a really bad road. You know? I mean, basically, Boots Riley, all respect to him, he had to make a retread, or I guess a remix of the elements of Sorry to Bother You, because not only did nothing change, not only did all the political problems that were affecting that moment persist, but we literally retreaded the same clown fascist again, almost like we couldn't help but to with Boots Riley himself. Hey, guess who's going to be president when you finally get to make your next picture, buddy? See if we could get ourselves into an even bigger disaster by the next time you rolled around, so that to a certain degree, it's almost like Riley's responsibility to just do Sorry to Bother You again, and honestly, to do it as an even bigger, but also more aggressive, more oppositional, more in your face, kind of intentional disaster as a complacent sci-fi action picture. A film where the exclusively intuitive, impertinent, free-ranging artistic aspirations of it literally consume and supersede any lingering imperative to make a movie that effectively rewards the American consumer's desire for climax, for closure. I Love Boosters is probably best described in those terms, as in intentional disaster, a work of art that effectively sabotages itself. At the very least, I think it marks a grand progression of Riley's talents as a filmmaker. He should still stop trying to be funny. I'm going to give it a 3 out of 5. With that, I'm getting out of here. Thank you so much for sticking through this whole video, and please don't be a stranger to shouting out in the comments, what did I get right? What did I get wrong? Otherwise, please share, like, subscribe, bell, yada yada. My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and this was the New Movie Diary. I'm going to catch you guys next time.